On this video, we will be discussing about the carotid triangle, and it is called as such because the most important structure in the carotid triangle is the carotid artery. But first, let's identify the landmarks. First, the mastoid process, the hyoid bone, then the thyroid cartilage, the clavicle, and lastly, the sternum. Now, for the boundaries, it is bounded posteriorly by the sternocleidomastoid, which originates from the manubrium sternum and the clavicle, and it inserts to the mastoid process. Next, it is bounded antero-inferiorly by the omohyoid muscles, more specifically the superior belly. The superior belly originates from the lower border of the hyoid, and then it inserts to the intermediate tendon of the clavicle, while the inferior belly originates from the scapula and suprascapular ligament. For the third border, it is bounded superiorly by the digastric muscle, more specifically the posterior belly of the digastric muscle, which originates from the mastoid process and it inserts to the intermediate tendon of the hyoid bone. So those are the boundaries of this triangle, the carotid triangle. Now, the floor of the triangle is formed by four muscles. First is the thyrohyoid muscle. It originates from the thyroid cartilage and it inserts to the lower border of the hyoid bone. Now, the next muscle is the hyoglossus muscle. It originates from the hyoid bone here, and then it inserts to the sides of the tongue. The third muscle is the middle constrictor muscle. It originates from the stylohyoid ligament and the hyoid bone, and then it inserts to the pharyngeal raphe. There you go. And then the last muscle forming the floor of the triangle is the inferior constrictor. It originates from the thyroid cartilage and the cricoid, and then it also inserts to the pharyngeal raphe as well. Now let's discuss the contents of the triangle. The first major content or structure is the common carotid artery, which has two branches, which is the ECA and the ICA. This is the common carotid artery, and then next, this is the external carotid artery, and the next one is this one. This is the internal carotid artery, and this is the carotid sinus, which monitors our blood pressure through its baroreceptors. Laterally to the common carotid artery is the internal jugular vein. This is the internal jugular vein. And then in the middle of the carotid artery in the internal jugular vein is the vagus nerve or cranial nerve 10. Now, these three major structures are enclosed by the carotid sheath. So this is a cross-sectional view of the carotid sheath. Medially is the common carotid artery, and then laterally is the internal jugular vein, and then in the middle of these structures on the more posterior aspect is the vagus nerve. That yellow structure in between the internal jugular vein and the common carotid artery. It is also important to note that that is the common diagram of the carotid sheath, but however, I'd like to emphasize that in Cummings, the contents of the carotid sheath are the following: the carotid artery, the internal jugular vein, the vagus nerve, and the ansa cervicalis nerve. Alright, we're now done with the common carotid artery, the internal carotid artery, the external carotid artery, the internal jugular vein, and the vagus nerve. Let's now discuss the different branches of the external carotid artery within the carotid triangle. The external carotid artery has a total of 8 branches, and 5 out of 8 branches are included in the carotid triangle. The first branch is the ascending pharyngeal artery. It goes medially and upwards to supply the different muscles and mucosa of the pharynx, even the tonsils and multiple cranial nerves, and etc. The next branch is the superior thyroid artery. this one. It is important to note that this artery has different branches, and the superior laryngeal branch pierces the thyroid membrane to enter the larynx, and it is important to note that this superior laryngeal artery branch of the superior thyroid artery is accompanied by the internal laryngeal branch of the superior laryngeal nerve of the vagus nerve as it pierces through the thyroid membrane. The next structure is the lingual artery. Now remember, the lingual artery loops upwards and then downwards, and then it goes behind the hyoglossus to reach the tongue. And then the next artery is the facial artery, this one. And then the last branch that's included in the carotid triangle is the occipital artery, this one. We are now done with the different branches of the ECA included in the carotid triangle. The next structure is the deep cervical nodes. We will use the internal jugular vein as marker for these nodes, and these are called the jugular nodes. And the next structure is the hypoglossal nerve or the cranial nerve 12, this one. Initially, it goes downwards in between the internal carotid artery and internal jugular vein, and then it goes forwards in front of both the internal and external carotid artery, and then it goes forwards just above the greater cornu of the hyoid bone in front of the hyoglossus, and then it goes to the tongue. Now, before we go back to the other structures, we will first go back to the vagus nerve and discuss it more in detail. Now, the vagus nerve has the longest course of all cranial nerves because it extends from the head to the abdomen. We know that it emerges from the anterior surface of the medulla oblongata, and it leaves the skull through what we call the jugular foramen. This is actually another topic, but let's focus first on the part of the vagus nerve that's included in the carotid triangle. Now, this is the vagus nerve. It goes vertically downwards in between the carotid artery and the internal jugular vein, and it gives two branches in the carotid triangle. The first branch is the pharyngeal branch. It runs inferomedially, which joins the pharyngeal plexus to supply the muscles of the pharynx except the stylopharyngeus, and also it supplies the soft palate except the tensor veli palatini. Now the second branch is this one. This is called the superior laryngeal nerve. It divides into the internal laryngeal nerve and the external laryngeal nerve. Now, it is important to note that these two branches, internal and external laryngeal branches, have close relations to certain important arteries. More specifically, the internal laryngeal branch is in close relation to this. This is the superior laryngeal artery, a branch of the superior thyroid artery. They together pierce the thyroid membrane. And another branch, the external laryngeal branch, is in close relation to the superior thyroid artery. Just to note, the internal laryngeal nerve or branch is sensory to the mucous membranes of the piriform fossa and also the larynx, and also down to the vocal cords. And on the other hand, the external laryngeal nerve goes downwards to supply the motor function of the cricothyroid muscle. Now, let's incorporate the vagus nerve to our initial diagram. So, let's first start with the pharyngeal branch. It goes inferomedially to join the pharyngeal plexus. So, this is the pharyngeal branch, the first branch in the carotid triangle. The second branch is the superior laryngeal branch, this one. Take note that it goes medial to the internal carotid artery and the external carotid artery. While, as you can see, the hypoglossal nerve is lateral to both structures, and the superior laryngeal branch of the vagus nerve is medial to both structures. Now, this is the external laryngeal nerve. It passes deep to the omohyoid and then it supplies the cricothyroid muscle. The next structure is the spinal accessory nerve or the cranial nerve 11, the spinal part. It initially goes downwards and then it goes backwards, superficial to the internal jugular vein to enter the sternocleidomastoid for which it supplies. It also supplies the trapezius muscle. Now, our last structure is the ansa cervicalis or C1, C2, C3. It is a loop of nerves which are formed by C1, C2, C3 that innervates the infrahyoid or the strap muscles, specifically the sternohyoid, sternothyroid, and omohyoid. It has two roots, the superior and the inferior root. The superior root is formed by the descending branch of the hypoglossal nerve carrying C1 fibers, and it descends downwards lateral to the internal carotid artery and common carotid artery. And the inferior root is derived from the C2 and C3 fibers, and the combination of these nerves descends lateral to the internal jugular vein and it continuously goes anteroinferiorly and it joins the superior root in front of the common carotid artery at the level of the cricoid cartilage. There we go, that's the carotid triangle. And in summary, the boundaries are the following. Posteriorly, the anterior border of the sternocleidomastoid muscle. Anteroinferiorly is the omohyoid superior belly. Superiorly, it's the posterior border of the digastric muscle. The floor is formed by the following. Thyrohyoid muscle, hyoglossus, middle constrictor, inferior constrictor. The contents of the triangle are the following. Common carotid artery, internal carotid artery, external carotid artery, its 5 branches which are the following: ascending pharyngeal, superior thyroid, lingual artery, facial artery, and occipital artery. Now, another content is the internal jugular vein, the jugular lymph nodes, vagus nerve, hypoglossal nerve, spinal accessory nerve, and lastly, the ansa cervicalis.